We're meeting again today to talk about some of the estimates in terms of Mexico's energy reform. The timing is always amazing these days when you talk about Mexico. Just yesterday, the results of the second power auction were announced, and it seems that they've continued to be quite successful. Something on the order of almost 4,000 megawatts awarded, investment around $4 billion. Effectively doubling the results of the April auction, which had impressed and been viewed as quite successful. So on the electricity side, in terms of reform in Mexico, things are moving quite well and quickly. Especially in terms of clean energy deployment. But today we want to drill down and focus specifically on natural gas, and as we say, understanding Mexico's natural gas market, and the understanding part being in the context of the post-reform, the new regulatory environment. And obviously, for those of you signing in today, know that the energy reform in Mexico has laid foundation and opened up a lot of the competition elements of the natural gas market in Mexico, with an eye towards boosting availability and competition in terms of separating pipelines from Pemex, in transportation elements, in terms of commercialization, access to pipeline capacity, a whole host of things that we'll get into today. And again, there was the massive amount of investment in pipelines since this reform and since the Peña Nieto government took over. Something on the order of $16 billion is on tap, according to CRE. But that's just a slight preview. I want to turn this over to our guest today, who has been looking at these issues very closely from ICIS, which is a periodical that focuses on energy issues and has created a specific Mexico energy report. We're happy to have James Fowler, who will be presenting today and sharing with us some of his insights and his firm's insights as to what the future has in store for some of these elements of Mexico's natural gas market in this new environment. James is a financial journalist. That's his background. He's covered energy markets, policies, and projects. Spent some time in Santiago. He worked at the Santiago Times, but also at a place I'm sure many know, the Business News Americas, and also done some work at Economist Intelligence Unit. And he's been at ICIS, which is spelled, justify, ICIS. Not to make a bad joke there, but it's not maybe listening to, but he's been covering ICIS. He's been working at ICIS since 2012, and so he's now working specifically on Mexico's power and gas market, and through the recently launched ICIS Mexico Energy Report, he will share some of their latest analysis. So just real quickly, one housekeeping note, just a reminder for those of you who've joined us before, and in case anyone is new, we will have a formal presentation as the agenda says here. Then we'll have a virtual and online question and answer session. That will be managed via the chat function, and you see I've posted a note there, but just so you can see again, if you have a question, simply type into the chat toolbar what you'd like to pose to James as part of our conversation after the formal presentation, and we'll get to that as soon as possible after the presentation. Don't wait. If you want to ask something, feel free to post it, and we'll get to that. So it's live, and you can post right there now during the presentation, or right when it's done, or during our Q&A session. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to James Fowler, who's live from Houston, though originally from England. James, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you very much to Jacqueline and the rest of the team at the Institute of the Americas for organizing this webinar. It's a real pleasure to be able to do this presentation with you guys. I'd like to thank everyone as well who's listening in or who has registered to get the slides later on. Hopefully you're going to find this presentation, the next 30 to 45 minutes, fairly insightful. Just to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'll give a brief introduction to ICIS, and thank you, Jeremy, for mentioning the spelling of the company, just so there's no confusion there. And then I'm going to talk about the market deregulation process in Mexico. What's been going on in Mexico over the past few years in terms of the opening up of the energy markets has obviously generated a lot of international excitement. But in terms of the gas market, we're really reaching a critical stage. In the next few months, we're going to see the final pieces of legislation put in place, which are going to deregulate the gas market and basically open it up for private participation. So I'll focus on that, and then we'll talk a little bit about actually what's going on in terms of demand fundamentals in Mexico, why there is this need for deregulation, and what we can expect from the Mexican market going forward in terms of demand and what to look for in terms of which sectors will be the most important in terms of sponsoring the growth of the gas industry in Mexico. And then finally, we'll have a few minutes at the end there for a Q&A session, as Jeremy mentioned. So altogether, the presentation should be about 30 to 35 minutes. So and then we should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So just to give you a quick introduction to ICIS, and yes, despite the situation in the Middle East, it is ICIS. We provide pricing information and market intelligence for global commodity markets. Now, the company's name stands for Independent Commodity Information Services, and we have been publishing information on global energy and chemical markets for the past 20 years. Our main focus is on providing news, pricing information and analysis to the chemicals, fertilizers and energy industries. Now, in the Americas, we are best known for our pricing and news coverage of the chemical and fertilizer markets. However, in Europe, we are the biggest provider of gas and power pricing across the continent. We hold the pricing benchmarks for the European equivalents of Henry Hub, the UK's MBP and Dutch TTF prices, and roughly around about, well, the majority of natural gas that's sold on a spot basis across Europe is normally indexed to our numbers. In the Americas, we have been present covering LNG markets from an energy point of view, both north and south of the equator since 2011. Last year, we also launched the ICIS Mexico Energy Report, which I'm the editor of. And this is the first English language report focused exclusively on the Mexican gas and power markets. Right now, we are publishing a limited amount of pricing information, but also a lot on news and projects covering the gas and the power markets. And our intention is to develop our coverage and to get to a point where we can provide some transparency for the gas and power markets, be it through the publication of pricing indexation, reference prices for these markets as they deregulate and as we see greater private participation and liquidity in the markets. Obviously, that's going to take a little bit of time. We're still in the process of really creating the legislative frameworks for the power and gas markets. And so now, right now, the report is focused on covering projects, legislation, new entrants, and really giving an idea of how the market will develop over the coming years. So now we've got the marketing material out the way. I'll push on with the presentation, and I want to first of all emphasize, as Jeremy mentioned, in terms of the overall energy reform, the gas market deregulation is part of a wider opening up of Mexico's energy market, which really began through the energy reforms which were passed in 2013. Now the whole energy sector, from upstream oil and gas to upstream oil and gas production, down to power generation and the import of liquid fuels, petrochemical sector, is all being opened up to private sector investment. A lot of the international attention has focused on upstream liberalization, and especially in terms of the private companies that are competing to take acreage in Mexico's upstream assets, for example, licenses for oil and gas exploration and exploitation. And we've seen already big international companies such as Eni, Lukoil, Statoil participating in some of the initial tenders. There's a lot of excitement surrounding the latest tender for upstream licenses, which will be at the end of this year in December. The kind of jewel in the crown, as it were, the deep water licenses, which are going to be offered offshore. And there's been a lot of interest from companies such as Shell, BP, Exxon. All the big international majors are looking at that to try and compete in the tender, which is going to be occurring at the start of July. I think that's the start of December, sorry, the 5th of December. But as I say, this is only one part of the energy reform process. And actually, as you get further into it and you look into further downstream in Mexico, you see there's a huge amount of opportunities which are opening up for private investment. And the gas market is one of those, one of the most dynamic or one of the most exciting reform process. So in terms of deregulation, the opening up of the midstream sector is really intended to correct imbalances in the Mexican gas market, which have been recorded since 2011, 2012. And these have been caused by stagnating domestic production and growing internal demand. State oil company Pemex has been the exclusive producer of gas within Mexico, the main provider as well to the Mexican market. And really, over the past few years, you've seen Mexican demand increasing from the power sector and the industrial sector. However, from Pemex as a company has been unable to maintain supply to the market, sufficient supply to the market to meet the needs of this growing consumer base. By deregulating the gas market, authorities hope to encourage private participation, capitalizing initially on the abundance of low-cost natural gas within the US. And as I'm going to explain as well, the US is a very important factor in this gas market growth that we're going to see as well. Gas will be used by the power sector to displace more expensive and carbon-intensive liquid fuels such as fuel oil and diesel in the generation mix, as well as cleaning up the generation mix as well, and also as a more cost-efficient fuel source for the industrial sector. Now, as I mentioned, until now, with the isolated exception of a few cases, if you wanted to buy natural gas in Mexico, the main company you would go to is Pemex, the state oil company. Pemex was the operator of the pipeline system, formerly known as the SNG, and now the Cistran gas system, and therefore would be paid as a transporter of molecules. It would be the transporter of natural gas across the country. Although rules allowed other companies to hold capacity in the pipeline grid, and state power utility CFE was able to do that to a certain extent, in practice, Pemex was the monopoly supplier to private sector consumers. They held a monopoly over the system capacity, and therefore the main company you would have to contract with in order to get molecules delivered to your door, not just as a transporter, but also as a shipper. Thanks to the reform, this is going to change. The biggest part of the reform is legislation guaranteeing access to Mexico's transmission system for third parties. And this legislation stipulates that all pipelines across the country, whether privately operated or belonging to the state, must be open access. To ensure that there is room for private parties to enter the market, Pemex will be required by law to reduce its current share of the market by 70% through the next 4 years. Now, this doesn't include Pemex's own demand for refining, for the petrochemical sector, and for cogeneration, but it does include the company's contracts with local distribution companies, the power sector, and industrial users. And that means that a huge amount of its existing customer base within Mexico, they will have to basically shed these contracts in line with the law. In order to ensure that these rules are being abided by in terms of opening up the market as well, there's been a new body created, which is to oversee the Cistran gas pipeline network, and that is Senegas. This transmission system operator will basically run the network and will become a central plank in gas market development going forward, effectively overseeing operation of the transmission system as well as encouraging the development of new projects and infrastructure. On this slide here, you can basically see the model for how the gas market is going to operate in the future. And you have on the far left end of the slide, you have the production and processing, the upstream end. The production, which was primarily coming from Pemex originally, but also has, through the next few years, thanks to the opening up of the upstream sector, there will be private companies getting involved in the production of natural gas within Mexico. And then you also have imports coming from the US or coming via LNG tanker as well. So that's the upstream, the supply end. And then you have the midstream sector, which will be operated in terms of transport, the Cistran gas network anyway, and which previously belonged to Pemex, will be completely operated by Senegas, which is the technical or the transmission system operator, the TSO. Senegas ensures the enforcement of vertical separation or no vertical integration, and that means that Well, Senegas will supply the role of transporter. Capacity within the pipelines themselves will be opened up for anyone to take. And this will be including companies such as Pemex, CFE, and private sector companies, wholesalers, for example, companies who are active in the US market, who will now be able to take capacity in the pipeline system and basically supply natural gas as the shipper to the end users. And that would be the industrial, power sectors, residential sectors as well. And so you really have Senegas entering in as the company that makes sure that there is a line, or there is no monopoly being taken part no monopoly taking place in the central part of the system, which is the central part of the process, the transfer of gas from upstream to downstream users. Important to note about Senegas that while they've been operational for 2 years, due to resource constraints, they continue to rely on Pemex to actually handle the operation of the pipeline system on a day-to-day basis. So in October last year, Senegas acquired the Cistern gas network from Pemex. However, at the same time, it signed a transitionary agreement allowing Pemex to continue to operate the pipeline system in the name of Senegas. And that agreement ends at the end of this year. Now, it had been expected that from the 1st of January 2017, Senegas would be able to take over complete control of operating the system. However, the latest indications are that Senegas will not be able to do so and may instead have to pay a third party to operate at least some parts of the Cistern gas network while it continues to resource or build its resources internally. Now, through the process of deregulating the market, Senegas is going to assume control over 7,000 kilometers of pipelines across 2 separate systems. The main prize is the Cistern gas network, as I mentioned, which was previously owned and operated by Pemex and provides the majority of the gas consumed within Mexico. Private pipelines are already in existence in Mexico outside of the Cistern gas network. And are operated by private companies, and we're going to see there's more private pipelines which are going to come online over the next few years as well. Now, these private pipelines will have the opportunity to opt in to the Senegas system should they choose to. Now, by doing so, private companies will retain ownership of the infrastructure. However, the management of day-to-day operations will be continued or will be retained by Senegas. And as of May this year, 6 privately owned pipelines had already been incorporated into the Cistern gas network. Now, in terms of capacity allocation, over the coming 6 months, we're going to see the capacity in the Cistern gas network basically passed out amongst existing consumers, and then what's left will be given to companies that currently don't have access to the market right now. And so this capacity allocation process will be taking place in 2 steps. The first of which will be the allocation of capacity to Mexico's power market, headed up by state power utility CFE and Pemex as well. Initial allocations to CFE and Pemex have been approved by Mexico's energy regulator, CRE. Now, the exact figures have yet to be published. However, it is understood from sources within Mexico that the allocations for CFE will stand at around about 1.1 BCF per day, and for Pemex around about 1.4 BCF per day. That's billion cubic feet per day. The figures that we've heard from the government previously is that in the Cistern gas network, around 6 to 6.5 BCF per day in total process. So if you take that ballpark figure of the CFE and Pemex's allocations, which is about 2.5 BCF per day, already nearly 40% of the system's capacity is going to be reserved by these 2 state companies alone. Once the allocations have been published, we will then move on to the second stage of the allocation process, and this will recognize the demand of third-party companies which currently have base supply commitments either from Pemex or the CFE, gas supplied through long-term contracts, basically. Now, this includes the CFE itself, which is going to have to which is going to have to go to the market and go through the process of the contracts that it has with Pemex in terms of supply. Also have the option to take that capacity in the system, as well as independent power generators. These are IPP companies, companies that operate in Mexico through a long-term contract with the CFE, sell electricity to the CFE through a power purchase agreement, and operate a CCGT and have gas delivered to them either by the CFE or by Pemex. These companies will now be able to secure capacity in the pipeline system, seeking supply from other companies should they wish, or maintaining their existing contracts with either CFE or Pemex. This second part of the allocation process also has to recognize the capacity demand of companies in possession of so-called acquired rights in the pipeline system. Now, these are big industrial consumers and local distribution companies which have had their demand recognized historically by Pemex. The problem that Senegas has had with these acquired rights holders is that their rights were allocated in kind of 2008 to 2010 period, kind of the height of the economic crisis, and so a lot of companies had their acquired rights recognized at a time when the demand was at quite a low level. Since then, we've seen that demand has obviously ramped up as economic activity has resumed, and so now these companies have more demand than they have acquired rights for. And the problem for Senegas, and as well as the Senegas alongside CRE, which is the energy regulator, and Mexico's energy ministry, SENER, in trying to work out the actual capacity allocations in the system, they are having to incorporate some of this incremental demand that was not recognized by the acquired rights originally granted by Pemex in the new allocation process. So it's been quite a complicated allocation process and required a lot of work to be able to figure out exactly who is entitled to what in terms of capacity in the system. In the end, the estimates that we have heard suggest that acquired rights holders will have demand in the region of around about 2 billion cubic feet per day. Now, if you add that to the baseload customers who we've been told have around about those that have contracts with Pemex and CFE now, that works out to about 1 billion as well on top of that. So that's 3 BCF per day in total. And then you have CFE and Pemex's allocations, which adds another 2.5 BCF per day. You're going to get to a point where only around about 10 to 15% of the system capacity is actually available for companies who don't have acquired rights or baseload contracts or are on Pemex or CFE, who are able to compete for capacity in the grid. There's only around about 10 to 15% of the total volume of capacity in the grid, which will be available for other parties to take through the open season round, which is included in the second part of the allocation or the capacity allocation process. Once this process has been done, authorities expect to be in a position to launch the new gas market in the first half of 2017. And it's expected that most of the acquired rights holders and baseload contract holders are unlikely to take actual physical possession of the capacity themselves, but instead will pass their rights on to wholesalers who will deliver the gas to them at the city gate or plant gate, and thus freeing the actual consumer up from the need to actually manage his or her own portfolio. If you're operating an industrial plant, it's probably far easier for you to assign the capacity to a supplier, be it a wholesaler from the US or a Pemex or a CFE, who can manage your portfolio for you, rather than you having daily to worry about managing the supply of capacity and having to balance the system along your own needs. Mexican authorities are also hopeful that this will happen, that wholesalers from the US will begin to enter into the Mexican market and provide an alternative supply source to Pemex and CFE. And if this is the case and sufficient companies are active in the market, authorities have signaled their intention to remove pricing controls for imports from the US. And that would be another important step in the deregulation process. Now, the idea of pricing controls it's quite a complicated one. Basically, Pemex, Pemex is regulated in terms of what it can charge per molecule of natural gas within Mexico by a formula which is called the Venta de Primer or VPM. And this pricing formula has been set by the CRE, and it's a formula which is reasonably transparent. It's convoluted and complicated, but it's reasonably transparent, and it's based upon a basket of different gas hubs in the US, such as Henry Hub, Houston Ship Channel, TETCO, and also includes the costs of transporting gas from southern Texas into the border regions. Essentially, there's actually two VPM prices, one for the north of the country, which is the Reynosa, that covers imports from the US, and then one for the south of the country, which is the Ciudad Pemex price, and that's the Ciudad Pemex gas processing plant in Tabasco State. And there's an arbitrage point between these two systems, but mainly the gas sold in northern Mexico, north of Tabasco, north of the Mexico City region. You've got gas sold in that area on the northern basis on the Reynosa price, and south of that on the Ciudad Pemex price. Now, VPM only sets the costs per molecule that Pemex can charge, and on top of that, you are going to, if you're a consumer, you will face transport tariffs and administrative fees, which mean that the end price that you pay is actually probably double the cost of VPM. Nevertheless, however, VPM has been seen as a barrier to competition entering the market because VPM prices in the past have been so closely indexed to the US. It's actually meant that at times the VPM price has been below the basket of US prices, and that means that Pemex has been importing natural gas from the US at a loss. Now, there were reforms to the VPM formula undertaken earlier this year, and that means that the prices are now a lot closer. However, it's still going to be very difficult in terms of a wholesaler trying to compete with Pemex if you know that Pemex's prices are kept artificially low, and you face the same problems having to import gas from the US into Mexico. Trying to take competition away from Pemex is going to be difficult when they have this artificially low cap to what they can charge per molecule. As part of a roadmap for market development, which was launched by CENER and CRE in July this year, they announced plans to actually relax the use of VPM once there exists competition in the pipeline system. Now, for gas imported from the US, this could happen as early as next year, should the capacity allocation process proceed as planned. However, as Pemex remains the sole producer and the sole company in charge of processing plants within Mexico, gas produced domestically, particularly in the south of the country, will likely remain under VPM control or remain under the VPM regime for the Ciudad Pemex price until we can see competition developing in the upstream side, and that might take a little longer, 2018, 2019. Now, this map here should give you a bit of an indication or help you at least get in mind what we mean when we're talking about the Cisterna gas network and the gas system in Mexico. The map, there's two different colors, as you can see, for pipelines. Now, the black lines represent pipelines which were in operation prior to the energy reform process in 2013. And the majority of these pipelines are included in the Cisterna gas network, which Senegas will be operating and which previously belonged to Pemex. The red lines are pipelines which have been built since the passage of the energy reform, or have come online since the passage of the energy reform. And there's some key projects you can see here. The Los Ramones pipeline project, which is here, coming down from New Eagleford into central Mexico, and then you've got the Texas Tuxpan pipeline here as well, which is running along the east coast of Mexico, just offshore, and will be delivering gas into industrial hubs along the east coast of Mexico, gas produced from the US. In total, over 9,000 kilometers of new pipelines are being built post-reform, almost exclusively by the private sector. Through the system expansion, natural gas will be brought to regions currently without connection to Mexico's pipeline grid, such as the northwest of Mexico up here, Sinaloa and Sonora states previously didn't have gas supply, and now new pipelines which have been sponsored by CFE as the main anchor customer and are being built by the private sector are going to deliver gas into these regions for the first time. And that opens up gas supply to the industrial sector and to residential users in those areas, previously without access to natural gas. New trunk lines are being developed as well, which will manage the supply of natural gas into central Mexico. Areas such as Guadalajara and Mexico City, which were particularly hurt by the imbalances over previous years. And then the infrastructure as well is there's plans for southern pipelines, which will extend potentially into Guatemala and open up the expansion of gas networks into Central America as well. Now, most of the pipelines north of Mexico City, so these red pipelines here are already under development, have been tendered out and are under development, and would be coming online probably within the next, most of them are expected to come online before the end of 2018. There's a few pipelines, primarily in the south, which have not yet been tendered, and there's an ongoing process where the updates on these projects are published every year. It's called the 5-year plan, and it was first published last year by Senegas. The first revision was published in July this year, and that revision of the 5-year plan actually postponed the tenders for some of these projects. So the Salina Cruz, the Tapachula pipeline going into Guatemala, the Acapulco pipeline, the Jaltipan Salina Cruz pipeline here going across the isthmus of the Tehuantepec, and then also some of the pipelines in the north, Colombia, Escobedo. The 5-year plan actually postponed a lot of these projects until 2017 at the earliest for tender. And so therefore, they're not likely to come online before 2019, 2020, if at all. An interesting kind of side development of this development of new pipelines is that where you have Senegas taking control of the Sistran gas network, all the pipelines which are currently being built are being built by the private sector, and these pipelines are not necessarily going to fall, well, are not going to fall under the remit of Senegas as the transmission system operator. The majority of the new pipelines which are coming online are being built under a BOOTS model, a build, own, operate, and transfer model. The CFE acts as the anchor customer for the projects, and then the company constructs the pipeline to meet the CFE's specifications. They will then hold an open season to see if third parties also want to secure capacity in the pipeline along its length. Now, these pipelines, as they are separate from the Sistran gas system, as I mentioned, don't actually fall under the remit of Senegas. And that's actually going to be the CRE, which will have oversight of these pipelines and ensure that CFE and the pipeline operators themselves, there's no collusion in terms of monopolistic practices, and that there is transparent access to information about idle capacity and open seasons. Another interesting part of this as well is that you're actually going to see the development of two different networks. If I go back to the map, you can see here that the red lines form their own kind of network, which is almost in certain regions parallel to the Sistran gas network. And where these two networks meet, there's going to be around about 15 connection points across Mexico. And these different pipeline systems are going to have alternative tariff structures. They're going to be bringing in gas from different parts of the US. And so therefore, there's going to be potential for arbitrage in these different regions in terms of if you can get gas cheaper through the CFE system to Guadalajara than you can do through the Sistran gas network, then you've got a cost advantage and will be able to take more market share in the Guadalajara region if you can get the molecules there cheaper. So that's going to be another important factor in terms of the drive for transparency, and something that the regulators have been keen to push, the need for companies to get involved in actually giving some transparency and indication as to the prices for natural gas in different parts of Mexico and where these pipeline systems connect. Now, as part of this infrastructure build out as well, we're going to see a rapid increase in the amount of import capacity Mexico is going to have from the US. This slide here basically shows the boxes represent import points of natural gas into Mexico. So in red you have the 3 LNG terminals, Costa Azul, Manzanillo and Altamira, and then in green boxes they represent the pipeline connection points per state between US and Mexico. And what you can see is in the pipeline sector, with all these projects which are being built or under development right now, a huge amount of import capacity being developed, particularly between Texas and northern Mexico. You can see capacity from Texas alone is expected to reach around about 12 BCF per day if all the pipelines which are currently proposed for the region are developed. 12 BCF per day by 2020. And overall, amongst the three states there, California, Arizona, if all the capacity is built, Mexico could have import capacity in the region of around about 14 BCF, to somewhere in the region of 17-18% of current total US gas production. Now, I don't think anyone expects all this capacity to be used straight away, not in the short term. However, most analysts are expecting that Mexico could certainly be importing around about 6 to 7 BCF per day. So if that's half the capacity used, and then you have demand swings and stuff that might actually push the port higher on certain days and in certain short periods. But certainly Mexican importers are going to have a real importance in the south of Texas in terms of pricing. The gas market in the south of Texas or across Texas is going to become increasingly volatile over the next few years, as you have LNG exports starting from the Gulf, and also you have new petrochemical industrial demand, power sector demand emerging, and then this surge in demand from Pemex as well, from Mexico as well. And so, Mexican buyers are going to have a certain amount of purchasing power within the southern US as well. So those slides there just give you an idea of the deregulation process and the infrastructure build out, what has been sponsored by the authority so far, and how they want to basically create a gas market, a more dynamic gas market, which is basically going to become an extension of the US. The final few slides I'm going to show you now just give you a brief example of how the market could develop in Mexico, and give you kind of some visualization between like the potential of the Mexican market and what's going to be driving demand. On this slide here, you can see predictions from CENER from their 15-year gas outlook, which was published at the end of last year. And it basically shows how they see demand evolving in Mexico over the next 15 years. And what you can see, the orange part of the chart represents natural gas imports primarily from the US, and the blue portion of the chart represents domestic production. Now, as I say, these are CENER's predictions. I hold no responsibility for them. And so please don't come to me and hold my feet to the fire and say that they're completely wrong. But they're a good indication and a good reference from the Mexican government as to how they see the market developing. And what you can see, the white line at the top of the chart basically represents total Mexican demand. And by 2029, that is expected to reach 11 BCF per day, according to CENER's predictions. This demand growth will be led primarily over the next couple of years by imports from the US, which are predicted to reach nearly 5 BCF, according to CENER, by 2017. Now, CENER says afterwards that they predict natural gas imports to fall, with new domestic production coming online either from Pemex or from the private sector when you have natural gas coming online from assets which have been awarded through the round one upstream process. However, in the present environment of prices in North America, it's very difficult to see that happening. If you're going to invest in new resources, particularly untapped resources in the north of Mexico, the Burgos Basin, or in the offshore region of Mexico as well, you require a decent price, or you require a decent return on your investment. And with Mexico so closely tied right now to US pricing and Henry Hub, that environment it's difficult to see that environment emerging anytime in the next few years. It's going to be a lot cheaper to actually buy the gas in Mexico, in the US, and just import it into Mexico through the infrastructure which is being built, rather than invest in the development of new domestic resources. And so therefore, CENER's predictions, which are based upon the idea of new production coming online, and this kind of eating into imports, I think are unfounded and are unlikely to be realized over the next few years. I actually think imports are going to continue growing through till 2020, and that's when you'll see a peak of of imports from the US by the end of the decade. Senegas themselves have said that they expect demand or imports from the US to reach around about 7 BCF by 2020, based upon the assumption that demand is going to grow, or imports are going to grow by around about MCF per year from this year through till the end of the decade. Now, to put a bit of context into where the demand is coming from within Mexico, I've again used some predictions from CENER. So again, don't hold me responsible if these prove to be unfounded. But what you can see is that CENER predicts that the majority or much of the new demand coming in Mexico is going to be coming from the power sector. The chart on the left-hand side of the screen, the red boxes or the red towers in there represent the power demand, and you can see it increasing from just under, from around about 3.5 BCF per day, reaching up to 5.5 BCF per day by 2029. And this is demand that's going to come from the CFE, but also private companies and cogeneration plants, companies who, through the opening of the power sector, are looking to compete with the CFE. On that same slide as well, you can see in the black towers demand from the oil sector, and this is primarily Pemex's own demand. Pemex is obviously facing a remit now to become more efficient and more cost-effective and more profit-driven. And while it's got this remit to also give up 60% or 70% of its market share in terms of supplying the Mexican market, it can use more of its natural gas production for internal operations, such as re-injection to stimulate oil production, or also in cogeneration and petrochemical facilities. Now, on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the chart there, which predicts that for both the power sector and the oil and gas sector, natural gas will be the fuel of choice, representing about 90% of all fuel consumed by 2022. Before that, however, the predictions also are based upon industrial and residential services demand from these sectors as well. And I actually think that those sectors are ones which are the predictions have been quite conservative. And we're going to see legislation probably passed in the next few months, which encourages the expansion of distribution networks across Mexico as the government looks to swap the use of LPGs and wood and other domestic fuel sources for natural gas, which is seen as cleaner and safer. And so you could actually, I think you're going to see a faster rate of growth in terms of residential demand and certainly industrial demand, because a lot of industrial consumers have not been able to get access to natural gas until now over the next few years. Last couple of charts I want to show, basically just to illustrate the importance of natural gas to the power sector. Over the next few years, Mexico has placed a big bet on the idea of having CCGT capacity, natural gas-fired resources supplying electricity across Mexico. And so over the next few years, you're going to see the installation of around about 25 gigawatts in new CCGT capacity across the power network through the next 15 years. And at the same time, over 12 gigawatts in thermal capacity from diesel, fuel oil and coal-fired plants will also be removed. And so CCGTs and gas-fired plants are going to become the dominant source of power generation on the grid over the next few years. Now, the graph on this slide shows you the relationship between natural gas consumption by the power sector and also average marginal power prices. And what you can see is the trend on this chart is one of increased consumption by the power sector, certainly from 2013 onwards, and this brings about a stabilizing in marginal power prices. So the lines on the chart there represent four of the most important nodes on the Mexican power grid. They show the average marginal power price per month at each of these nodes: Central, which is Mexico City; Monterrey, which is in the northeast; Occidental, which is the Bajío region, close to Aguas Calientes; and Veracruz, which is in the east of the country. As you can see, the general trend from these blue towers is that gas consumption is rising, and that brings about greater stability in terms of pricing, marginal power pricing. certainly from 2015 onwards, you can see greater stability as consumption from the power sector averages above 1.2 billion cubic meters per month. And finally, on this last slide as well, this slide compares those 4 nodes on the power grid that I used before to 2 other regions where gas supply has been more sporadic. And what you can see here, the green line represents La Paz, which is at the foot of the Baja California Peninsula, and this makes prices in the region extremely volatile and some of the most expensive nationally because they don't have access to natural gas. Generation in that area is all based upon fuel oil, diesel, and so in terms of access to natural gas, you don't have the option to use this more stable and cost-efficient, or stably less volatile priced commodity to generate electricity, and so as a consequence, power prices are a lot more volatile, and the most expensive were in Mexico. The purple line there also represents the Merida node, which is on the Yucatan Peninsula. And this is another region that's been blighted by supply shortages in the past. And the jump in prices you can see in April 2015 in that purple line actually came as the result of an explosion at an offshore gas processing plant belonging to Pemex. And this knocked out around about 500 MCF per day in supply to the southeast of Mexico, forced generators to turn away from CCGTs and onto diesel, liquid fuel fired power plants, or importing power from other parts of Mexico, which then caused marginal prices to go up because you've got higher transmission and congestion costs. In conclusion, then, it's important to underline the fact that Mexico is really undergoing quite a revolution in terms of its natural gas market. You've got a fast-growing sector, a huge amount of demand for natural gas, which is only growing. You've got a great potential supply resource across the border in the US, and then domestically in the longer term. And you've got a sector which is opening up for private investment, not just on the upstream, on the downstream, but also in terms of providing infrastructure and acting as a trader within the Mexican market. There's going to be plenty of opportunities emerging for companies, for the private sector across North America to get involved in the Mexican market over the next few years. Now, the deadlines that I mentioned in terms of the capacity allocation process and the launch of the market are likely to change somewhat given the vast amounts of legislation which authorities are trying to pump out. Now, this is not intended as a criticism. I mean, we have to recognize that there's so much going on in Mexico that inevitably deadlines get pushed back. But one thing the government is committed to is achieving an open gas market before change of government occurs at the end of 2018. Deregulation is seen as a way of stimulating the national economy as well as domestic production. In the long term, the idea of the deregulation process is that it will lead to the creation of a market where internal demand is so strong as to underpin development of some of Mexico's own domestic resources. The EIA estimates that the country has around about 545 trillion cubic feet in potential reserves, which can be developed in the long term. However, in the short term, you've got Mexico becoming basically an extension of the US market, and with up to 75% of all gas consumed in the country coming from north of the border, potentially by the end of the decade. Now, this means that Mexico is getting very sensitive to pricing changes in the southern US. And one thing many experts predict is that there will be more volatility with all the new demand coming from the US power and industrial sectors, as well as LNG exports. Mexican authorities have been keen to promote the use of a domestic reference price, and this will occur. However, it's going to take some time. Because you're going to have a unique set of circumstances with so much gas coming from the US, and you really need also alternative supply sources in the sense of domestic production. However, one thing is for certain, there is going to be a lot of interest in Mexico across the North American natural gas market. You've got a market which is really emerging in terms of demand and in terms of the opportunities that private sector companies are going to have to get involved in supplying this new market. And so there's a huge range of opportunities emerging from the gas market. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for everyone for listening in, and hand it back over to Jeremy if we've got some time for questions.
Oh, well, no, absolutely. In fact, James, there's questions flying in for the last several minutes. So thank you so much for that extremely insightful presentation. You know, the stagnating domestic production, that's not something we haven't heard about from Mexico. But I appreciated your insights on the whole question of balancing that issue in domestic production in Mexico with imports from the U.S. And that's obviously something that we're all seeing here in terms of the expansion of the pipeline network. But I want to get into some of this, and I think particularly some of the things you got into. There's been some questions about the gas transmission system, a lot of nuance, what seems to be your thoughts on how to navigate such a complicated system, especially in terms of this deregulated market in the model. So let me just, without any particular order, I'll jump into sort of as they came in. There's a very specific question about the pipeline to Guatemala, and I think you said that that was going to be postponed, but just confirm that information, please.
Yeah, that's correct. So the original intention was that the Tapachula pipeline, there would be an extent, well, the pipeline grid itself would be a pipeline running across from Jaltipan, which is on the Gulf Coast, to Salina Cruz, where there's a refinery operated by Pemex, and then from Salina Cruz down to Tapachula, which is on the border with Guatemala. And from there, you would then have gas delivered into Central America, to Guatemala and to other countries. This pipeline had originally been expected online by around about 2018, hasn't even been tendered yet, and I think it's likely to be pushed back probably until towards the end of the decade. There's still some doubt as to who wants to handle this project because it's tied to a Pemex refinery. Pemex are keen to manage the construction of this project, so it's unclear whether it will actually be get out or whether Pemex themselves will handle it. I've spoken to people in Pemex before as well, and they're kind of there's a little bit of a reluctance in terms of commit to the project because it's going to be expensive. And if you think about it, the Central American market, while it has a lot of potential, right now there's nothing there in terms of gas demand, and so there's going to be a lot of upfront investment, and you're going to be creating a market, but for a company such as Pemex, it's kind of difficult for them to justify that kind of investment when they've got so many other pressures going on in terms of meeting domestic demand and focusing on upstream production as well. So that project has been postponed, and to be honest with you, to tell you when it's going to be online, I think it's probably something that'll be pushed back into early the next decade, I would imagine, if it happens.
Okay, yeah, there's definitely a lot of interest there from folks in Central America, particularly I think as LNG maybe starts to arrive in El Salvador. But let's move on here. Just real quickly, speaking of LNG, there was some commentary, and thanks everyone for being so active on the chat function here. Question about pipeline to La Paz, and I think on one of your slides there was a dashed line, and so clarify a little bit in terms of the network and what or how does Mexico build gas to arrive into La Paz?
Yeah, so the CFE has a tender which is still actually open now. It hasn't been closed, but the idea was they left the technology type for delivering natural gas into the Baja California Peninsula, the area around La Paz. They left that open. And so the idea would be that a company can propose either the building of a pipeline or an small-scale LNG project to ship gas into that region. And so far, the majority of, as I understand it, from companies that are participating in the tender, is to actually build a small-scale LNG project around Topolobampo or somewhere on the Sinaloa coastline, and then sending that across by a small-scale LNG tanker into the tip of the Baja California Peninsula.
Excellent. So stay tuned as to that CFE tender and how it evolves.
Yeah, that'll close. It'll close in. I think it closes in October, November, and so we should have the winning bid by the end of the year.
Excellent. Thanks for that clarification. Let me roll a couple of these questions together because I think it has to do a little bit with CNH and the upstream and some of the bid rounds. One of them, and you got into this a little bit, it's the question of balancing Mexican domestic production, but specifically Burgos production, balancing, or how does that compete with U.S. gas price and imports? And then the second piece of that, just to roll this into a broader question from someone about the open market prices from CNH blocks Do you believe that CNH contractors will be able to sell their production at open market prices, or will there be government netback prices that need to still apply?
Well, that's a very good question. It's one that I've yet to see much clarity on it in terms of production within Mexico. If you're going to have that where there will be market prices, you need to get rid of the VPM price. As if that's the case where you're producing natural gas, and then right now you have to process it. The only company that processes it is Pemex, and so therefore Pemex is still limited by the VPM price as to what it can sell with natural gas within Mexico. And so in order for that to happen, I would imagine you've got to get rid of the VPM price even for the Ciudad Pemex in the south of the country. And that's probably going to take a couple of years to happen for that to occur. And that's tied in with the idea of development of the Burgos and development of the offshore resources. There is a tremendous amount of gas in Mexico which can be exploited. The problem is the pricing environment right now. If you're looking at the Burgos Basin and you're looking at the northeast of Mexico, you've got basically an area which is very similar to the Eagle Ford in the south of Texas. If you're going to exploit that, however, you need infrastructure in place. You need to invest in various different things in terms of getting roads, water, and getting also security is an issue which has not been touched upon in that region. If you think about it, you've got an already mature asset in the Eagle Ford just across the border where you can produce natural gas at prices of linked to Henry Hub. It's much easier to get the gas from there brought into Mexico than it would be in terms of investing in the Burgos Basin, which is basically virgin territory, and same with the offshore resources as well. So what it really needs is probably some kind of higher natural gas price for North America before these resources become lucrative to develop, or the government comes up with some other way to stimulate the development of these regions.
So we're talking, a midterm kind of scenario before you really could see significant amounts of production in Mexico that would make sense to come online, which gets to another question here about what comes online in 2018. Is that part of the current upstream bid round?
Well, that's exactly that's unclear, and that's why I used those Senate predictions, because Senate had estimated that they thought demand would be, or that domestic production would be coming online in 2018, potentially from some of the initial bid rounds or initial licenses that have been awarded through the upstream rounds. But as you can see, a lot of the licenses that have been awarded in this process, not many of them are very gas heavy, and those that are, as I say, are requiring a lot more in terms of investment. So it's difficult to see. I use those Senate predictions as an example, but kind of an example for me to argue against, because it's hard to see where new sources of production domestically are going to come online in the short term, especially in the existing pricing environment. Pemex could be one potential source, but again, Pemex, as I mentioned, is a company which is concentrating on more lucrative, and that would seem to me to be the oil industry rather than the gas industry, especially if its gas prices are limited on the domestic market by the VPM formula.
So that we got about 3 or 4 minutes left before we've got to wrap up, and so James, let's take two things here. One is something I wanted to ask you about, and then we'll finish with somebody else's question. You had said that the scenario estimates were a bit conservative in terms of demand. I want to understand from your perspective what you think. Well, they show what seems to be not very much demand growth in terms of industrials. Tell me what you think a more realistic is, and if not, why is there so little demand growth from industrials in Mexico?
Well, I mean, that's the benefit of being a journalist rather than an analyst. We don't make forward predictions, and so we just get to criticize everyone else's. I think in terms of, and a lot of my, I've been concentrating on the Mexican gas sector for about 2 years now, and talking to a lot of consumers across the country, and it seems to me that there is this enormous latent demand for companies wanting to get access to natural gas. And really the expansion of the network is a key part of that. The idea that gas is going to be delivered into regions which until now have not had access to the fuel source. And so in terms of the industrial sector, there are a lot of companies who have never had the option of LNG, have never had the option of a natural gas before, who are going to be, are really interested in using it as a fuel for their industrial processes. So I think that's certainly an area of growth that could have been understated by Sener. And also, in terms of residential demand, you actually talk to authorities across Mexico, and they say, look, you've got this country which has had a mix of huge industrial accidents, and the idea is that if you're having a natural gas distribution network, it's a lot safer and it's a lot more efficient and cleaner. And so there's definitely on the part of authorities a desire to swap the use of wood or LPGs, which are the main kind of fuel source for within the Mexican home, for local distribution networks. And legislation about opening up distribution networks is actually going to be published within the next year, which should really help to kind of push the demand from the residential sector, or encourage anyway companies to develop natural gas networks on a local distribution-wide basis and extend the supply into the home. So exact figures, I off the top of my head, I couldn't give you anything, but I certainly think there's room for demand from the residential and the industrial sectors to be higher than as was predicted by Sener in those graphs.
You remind me the recent passing of an author, a book that became a movie, and the catchphrase was, "If you build it, they will come." So,
yeah. Yeah, I mean that's and if you hear senior members of the Mexican government and senior members of the CFE have said that before. They have this confidence that they believe they build the infrastructure and the market will develop. Remains to be seen, but they seem pretty confident about it anyway.
Absolutely. Well, one more question, and I think it's an interesting one here, has to do your thoughts, and the specific question is, are you worried that Senegas has three functions that have the potential for a conflict of interest? Pipeline dispatching regulator, owner of Pemex's gas pipeline system, and system expansion planner. Thoughts on this?
I think, good question again. Senegas, I've got a difficult job, and they've been keen to point out that their primary focus is the operation of the transmission of the Sistran gas network, and also the ensuring basically that Pemex and the CFE in the pipelines that they have jurisdiction over are playing by the rules and are not holding capacity and are not preventing for whether it be wholesalers or end of the line consumers from getting access to the pipeline system. I think Senegas, it's going to be difficult for them, but I think they've got good people in charge there, and I think that they, in terms of being a transmission system operator, they're well placed to be able to fill out that role. In terms of planning, that's another thing, and I think, they've already had to push back the formal handover in terms of them assuming control over the pipeline system from Pemex, and the idea is now that they're talking about a third party entering next year, and that will have to be someone that doesn't own infrastructure in the network, which means it's going to be quite complicated to find that potential partner. And in terms of planning as well, they already had these pipelines that they were planning to push through this year, next year, and they've been pushed back as well. It's a difficult task that they have, because you're creating something out of nothing, and there's certainly a resource issue there. In the long run, I think they've got good people in charge there, and I think they will be able to carry out the remit. But it's just going to take time. It's going to require patience. One area where it will be interesting to see is whether the pipelines where Senegas doesn't have control over, that's going to be interesting to see how CRE is able to regulate those pipelines, because you have the CFE, which is the anchor customer, and then you have private companies operating that, and you don't have a Senegas, which is ensuring there's no collusion there. It's going to fall on the CRE, and again, the CRE is a very competent body as well, but they too are swamped with so many different legislative matters and so many different regulatory matters right now that there's a lot that's being asked of them, and so that's something that needs to be watched as well.
No, absolutely. I mean, as I led off the beginning, there's so many pieces of this energy reform, and I think a lot of credit should be given for the amount that has been accomplished and how fast things are moving, especially when you look at the strong headwinds of the current oil and gas price market. So, James Fowler, thank you so much. This has been great, a wonderful addition to our webinar series and looking into how Mexico's gas market deregulates. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'd be remiss if I didn't tout our upcoming program in Mexico City. We're not going to talk specifically about gas. We're going to talk a little bit more about the energy transition and some of the clean energy goals, some of the issues associated with the energy transition in Mexico, clean energy goals. So join us October 13th in Mexico City. I also want to thank our sponsor, Intercap Energy Systems, for their support of the energy webinar series. And if anyone is interested in presenting or sharing ideas with us, or better yet, sponsoring our webinar series, please do not hesitate to reach out and contact either me or Jacqueline Sanchez. And thank you, Jacqueline, for your help today. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We will try to get this recording put together and the slide deck and everything out to everyone later today, but first thing in the morning at the latest. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day. Thanks again, James.
Thank you. Thank you all.